right, welcome to the Explainer. Today we're looking at the absolute most hilarious, catastrophic, and stupidly expensive ego trip of the 17th century. Picture this. You're the king of a rising empire, you're fighting a massive war, and you want to build the ultimate weapon of mass destruction to just utterly flex on your enemies. But, thanks to your own sheer arrogance and a complete, spectacular disregard for basic physics, you accidentally build the world's most expensive submarine instead. Welcome to the epic disaster of the Swedish warship Vasa. It's a glorious story that proves human stupidity has always been miles ahead of its time.
So what exactly happens when you hand a hyper-ambitious, impatient monarch a completely blank check, surround him with an army of spineless yes-men, and just entirely delete the laws of physics from the group chat? Well, you get the Vasa. This thing was supposed to be a top-heavy, over-decorated floating fortress designed to strike absolute terror into the Polish and the Danes. But, spoiler alert, this absolute marvel of engineering was so profoundly botched, it couldn't even survive a gentle summer breeze without completely rolling over and giving up on life. 20. Just 20. That is exactly how many minutes this so-called invincible flagship managed to actually stay afloat on its maiden voyage. 20 minutes! I mean, you literally can't even get a decent pizza delivered that fast, and these guys managed to plunge a national treasure straight to the bottom of Stockholm Harbor in front of a massive crowd of cheering citizens and foreign spies. It is the absolute maritime equivalent of tripping over your own shoelaces while walking up to accept an Oscar.
Let's meet the mastermind behind this engineering atrocity, King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. He was, without a doubt, the ultimate nightmare client. You know the exact type. He wanted a massive floating fortress to project his imperial might, but he treated state-of-the-art naval architecture like a sandbox game. Instead of actually letting the experts do their jobs, he just constantly changed the design requirements, throwing out completely psychotic demands long after construction had already started.
This is just a brilliant illustration of the absolute bureaucratic nightmare of scope creep. The poor shipwrights start with a normal, 111-foot keel. But then the king hears a rumor that rival Denmark is building a bigger ship, so he throws a royal tantrum and screams, "Make it 135 feet!" But the base wood was already cut. What do? They literally just scarf, or splice, extra wood onto the bottom. And as if that wasn't unhinged enough, the king demands they cram in a second fully enclosed gun deck on a shallow, narrow keel. Physics is literally weeping in the corner right now. 64. That is the number of absurdly heavy 24-pounder bronze cannons the king insisted on jamming into those newly added upper decks. Look, in naval architecture, there's a very simple, idiot-proof rule. Put the heaviest stuff at the bottom so the ship doesn't, flip upside down. But no! Gustavus wanted maximum firepower up high so it looked intimidating. He raised the center of gravity to a truly comical level. It is the exact equivalent of balancing a bowling ball on top of a toothpick and expecting it to hold steady during an earthquake.
And to make this atrocity even worse, let's talk about the workforce. They had Swedish and Dutch carpenters working simultaneously on opposite sides of the ship. And guess what? They used two entirely different sets of rulers. The Swedish foot was exactly 12 inches. The Amsterdam foot was 11 inches, meaning they literally accidentally built a lopsided asymmetrical hull that was significantly heavier on the port side. I mean, you genuinely cannot make this level of incompetence up. It is actually impressive how bad this is.
Before they launched this glorious mess, the military brass decided to conduct a stability test. It was called the Lurch Test, and it was highly scientific. It basically consisted of watching 30 dudes run back and forth from one side of the upper deck to the other just to induce a roll and see if the ship would instantly flip over. It's the 17th century equivalent of kicking the tires on a car that is currently engulfed in flames.
It took exactly 3 passes. Just 3. Before the ship rocked so violently that the terrifying roll forced them to completely abort the test. They had to stop the men immediately just to prevent the Vasa from capsizing right there at the dock. The ship was practically screaming, begging them not to put it in the actual ocean.
Enter Vice Admiral Clash Fleming, who personally watched this terrifying physics demonstration. Does he stop the launch? Does he say, "Hey guys, maybe we shouldn't send 150 people onto a ship that rolls over when 30 guys go for a jog"? Absolutely not. He famously muttered, "I wish the king were at home." Because he was completely terrified of his boss, who was off in Prussia demanding his new toy, he cowardly ignored the failed test and ordered the fundamentally unstable monstrosity to launch anyway.
So, get this, they confidently launched the most powerfully armed vessel in the world, knowing full well it was completely and fatally unseaworthy. Just look at the sheer volume of red flags here. A disastrously failed Lurch Test, a completely asymmetrical hull built with mismatched rulers, a shallow keel with zero space for the heavy stone ballast needed to keep it upright, tons of heavy bronze guns piled up to the sky, and hundreds of massive heavy oak sculptures added just to feed the king's massive ego. An absolute masterclass in how to build a disaster.
On August 10, 1628, the grand launch became a rapid-fire comedy of errors. The ship departs the dock. It fires a majestic ceremonial salute. The crowd goes wild. And then, a pathetic, incredibly light 4-knot breeze hits the sails. The ship tilts ominously, manages to briefly correct itself, catches another tiny puff of wind, and effortlessly tips over. It was over almost as soon as it began.
But the absolute worst part? Because they desperately wanted to fire that flashy, arrogant salute for the massive crowd of spectators and VIPs, the lower gun ports were left completely wide open. So, when that tiny gust of wind caused the ship to tilt, the ocean didn't just splash the side. It poured straight into the open lower decks in a massive torrent. Once the water crossed that threshold, there was absolutely zero chance of recovery. Game over.
1,400. That is the pathetic total distance in yards that this billion-dollar piece of maritime art actually traveled. It literally didn't even make it a single mile before sinking 105 feet down to the muddy bottom of the harbor. And the absolute best part? Foreign spies representing rival nations were standing right there on the shore, watching the entire humiliating spectacle unfold, probably laughing their heads off at the Swedish Empire's massive cell phone.
But, setting these cynical jokes aside for a second, the reality of the human toll is incredibly grim. Dozens of sailors, along with innocent women and children who were invited on board just for the ride, tragically perished just 390 feet from the shoreline. We're talking about 30 to 50 completely unnecessary casualties in an entirely preventable display of imperial hubris. So naturally, a furious King Gustavus gets the news of his sunken toy 2 weeks later and demands an official inquiry. Heads are gonna roll, right? Someone's getting fired into the sun. But here's the problem. Absolutely no one wanted to shoulder the blame and risk getting executed. The captain blamed the builders blamed the dead original designer, and literally everyone in that room secretly knew the real culprit was the king himself, but you don't exactly point fingers at an absolute monarch unless you want your head displayed on a pike.
In a brilliant stroke of toxic corporate strategy, the inquiry found the perfect, flawless scapegoat. They pinned the entire fiasco squarely on the master shipwright, Henrik Hibbertson. Why? Because he had conveniently died a full year earlier from an illness. You can't execute a corpse, and a corpse can't argue back. Case closed. Nobody living gets punished, the king's fragile ego remains completely intact, and the ship is left to rot in the mud.
And this brilliant cover-up is exactly why this disaster literally birthed the term Vasa syndrome in modern management literature. It perfectly summarizes what happens when spineless yes-men meet terrible project management. You've got the psychological safety vacuum, where subordinates are too terrified to tell the boss the actual truth. You've got extreme requirement instability, also known as constant scope creep without checking the actual physics. And you have plan continuation bias, proceeding with a clearly doomed launch simply because of sunk costs and administrative momentum. And the crazy part? We're still doing this today?
Let's fast forward a few centuries. In a twist of pure unadulterated irony, the Vasa survived down there in the dark for 333 years solely because the Baltic Sea is incredibly gross. It is simply too brackish and polluted for the wood-eating shipworms to survive. So this toxic, freezing mud essentially acted as a giant, perfect time capsule, preserving the greatest failure in Swedish naval history. Fast forward to 1961, and Swedish marine engineers managed to pull off a completely miraculous salvage operation. They actually lifted this incredibly well-preserved 17th century artifact back to the surface. It was a global media sensation, raising a practically intact, incredibly intricate warship that had been sleeping with the fishes since the 1600s.
But pulling it up just triggered another massive engineering headache. You can't just pull 300-year-old waterlogged wood into the dry air. It'll instantly shrink and shatter into dust. They had to tunnel under it in pitch-black mud, lift it in 18 incredibly delicate stages, and then literally spray the entire ship with synthetic wax 24 hours a day for 17 straight years just to replace the water in the wood cells. Plus, they had to painstakingly swap out thousands of rusting iron bolts for custom stainless steel ones just so the acid wouldn't eat the wood from the inside out.
But wait, the irony continues.
This glorious, preserved failure is currently busy slowly crushing itself under its own massive weight inside the museum. After centuries underwater, the wood's structural integrity is completely shot, with the ability to carry loads dropping by up to 80% in some places. The ship is literally sagging and leaning to the port side all over again. You really can't teach an old, fundamentally flawed dog new tricks. To keep Sweden's biggest tourist attraction from collapsing into a pile of incredibly expensive, historic toothpicks, modern engineers are desperately intervening once again. By 2028, which perfectly coincides with the 400th anniversary of its sinking, they're building a massive internal and external steel skeleton to prop it up. It is the ultimate high-tech life support system for a ship that couldn't even manage to support itself for 20 minutes.
So, the crucial point we're left with is this. Is the Vasa a stunning triumph of modern archaeology, or just the ultimate historical roast of terrible, arrogant management? It really makes you wonder how many modern megaprojects, whether it's software, architecture, or massive government initiatives, are suffering from the exact same blinding hubris right now, just without the shiny bronze cannons. What is the modern equivalent of the Vasa that we're blindly launching today? Think about that next time you're stuck in a project meeting where nobody wants to tell the boss the truth. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.